I had never really paid much attention to the Homeowners Association, HOA, in my neighborhood. As a federal judge, I had handled countless complex cases, faced off against the toughest attorneys, and ruled on multimillion-dollar disputes. But the HOA? To me, they were just a group of self-appointed local authorities whose primary goal was to impose ridiculous rules on their neighbors. I had lived here for nearly 10 years. My house sat at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by old oak trees that I had cared for over the years. They not only provided shade in the summer but also gave me a sense of peace after long days in court. I had never paid much attention to the HOA, and they had no reason to bother with me, at least not until this morning. As I stepped outside to grab my newspaper, the sight before me left me stunned. My entire row of oak trees, the very ones I had planted and nurtured for a decade, had been chopped down. The once proud trunks lay sprawled across the ground, branches scattered everywhere. There was no shade left, only the brutal remains of what had once been a thriving part of my home. It took me a few seconds to collect myself, trying to process what had happened. Who did this? And for what reason? I quickly scanned the area. There were no workers, no tree-cutting equipment in sight. But then, I noticed a piece of paper taped to my front door. I walked over, tore it down, and read it. Asterisk, all trees in the community must align with the neighborhood's landscape plan. The Homeowners Association has determined that certain trees were non-compliant and has removed them to maintain the community's aesthetic standards. Thank you for your cooperation. I read it again, feeling my blood boil. They did this without my permission? Without any prior notice? Asterisk, asterisk. Clutching the paper tightly, I turned and stormed back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let this slide. The first step in any case is to gather evidence. I turned on my computer and accessed my security camera system. As a judge, I had always been meticulous about protecting my home, and having a surveillance system was one of the precautions I had taken. I rewound the footage from last night. And then I saw them. Around 3 a.m., a group of uniformed workers appeared in my front yard. They carried chainsaws and trimming equipment. But what enraged me the most was the woman standing beside them, overseeing the entire process, none other than HOA President Linda Harper. She stood with her arms crossed, watching as each tree was cut down with a composed expression, as if this was simply routine business. I felt my entire body tense with anger. She had personally ordered this. I fast-forwarded through the footage until they left, then downloaded the entire recording onto my hard drive. I had the evidence. And I wasn't going to let this go, asterisk, asterisk. After printing out a copy of the footage and saving it onto a USB drive, I drove straight to the HOA office, where Linda Harper typically worked. As I walked in, a young receptionist looked at me warily. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" "I think she'll want to see me right away." I placed a copy of the HOA notice, the one they had taped to my door, on the desk. "Tell her that Judge David Carter wants to talk." It took less than a minute before the office door swung open. Linda Harper appeared, wearing the same confident, arrogant expression. "Judge Carter," she said, unfazed. "I wasn't expecting a visit from you. And I wasn't expecting you to order the destruction of my property in the middle of the night without my consent," I replied, keeping my voice calm but firm. She shrugged. "We only did what was necessary to maintain the community's standards. Those trees didn't fit the landscape plan." I placed the USB drive on her desk. "I have video proof that you ordered this. Do you realize that your actions were illegal? You had no right to touch my private property without my permission." Linda's expression remained composed. "If you have a complaint, you're welcome to file it with the HOA board. We have procedures for resolving disputes." I met her gaze directly. "I don't need your procedures. I have the law on my side. And I guarantee you will regret trespassing on my property." She smirked. "You're welcome to try." I stood up, taking the USB drive. "I'll do more than try. You just made a serious mistake, and I'm going to make sure you understand that." As I left the HOA office, I knew this battle had only just begun. Linda Harper thought she could abuse her authority without consequences. But she had forgotten one thing: I am a federal judge. And I know exactly how to bring justice. I am not someone who loses my temper easily, but when I returned home and saw my barren yard, I knew I couldn't let this go. Linda Harper might think the HOA has absolute power in this neighborhood, but I know the law better than anyone. And I was going to prove it to her. I stepped inside, made a cup of coffee, and sat down at my desk. The first thing I needed to do was identify exactly which laws the HOA had violated. I grabbed my laptop, opened the state legal codes, and began my research. According to state law, any act of trespassing or destruction of private property without the owner's consent is considered illegal. The HOA had no right to unilaterally decide to cut down trees on private property. I flipped through my home purchase contract. While this neighborhood did have an HOA, my contract contained no clause granting them authority over my yard's landscaping without my permission. That meant the HOA had overstepped its legal boundaries. I recalled the vague financial reports the HOA sent out to residents each year. If they were willing to do something as outrageous as cutting down my trees, who knew what else they were doing with the residents' funds? I took a sip of coffee, my eyes fixed on the screen. I wasn't just going to sue them for property damage. I was going to dig deeper, uncover every violation, and bring Linda Harper down. ***. #gathering allies. I couldn't do this alone. The HOA had power, but I knew I wasn't the only one fed up with them. If I could find other residents who shared my goal, I could build a movement against them. I started with James Parker, my neighbor across the street. James was a retired veteran who had lived here for nearly 20 years. I rang his doorbell, and within seconds, the door swung open. "David." James frowned. "What's going on?" "I need to talk to you about the HOA, I said calmly. James crossed his arms. "What did they do this time?" "Last night, they cut down all the trees in my yard without my permission," I told him. James blinked, then let out a sharp curse. "Those bastards." I knew it. The HOA keeps getting worse. "And that's not all," I continued. "I've been investigating their financial records. I have reason to believe the HOA is embezzling community funds." James was silent for a few seconds, then nodded. "I've always suspected that. I've paid thousands in fees every year, and I have no idea where the money goes. If you can prove this, I'm in." I extended my hand. "Can you rally others?" James shook my hand firmly. "I know a few people who are just as angry as I am. I'll gather them." One ally secured. The battle had just begun. The unraveling of the HOA. Over the next few days, I quietly approached more residents. It turned out I was not alone. One family was fined by the HOA because their son left his bicycle on the driveway too long. An elderly widow was forced to repaint her entire house because the color was not up to standard. A young couple was nearly sued for installing a solar panel without HOA approval. Frustration was boiling over. But the most damning evidence I uncovered was in the HOA's financial records. I had requested a copy of their reports and found suspicious expenses. $50,000 for a landscaping improvement project that no one had seen. $30,000 paid to a company that didn't exist. Thousands of dollars in unaccounted spending. They were stealing from the residents. I immediately contacted a financial attorney. After analyzing the records, she confirmed that this was embezzlement. If exposed, Linda Harper could face criminal charges. Now, I had everything I needed. It was time to act. ***. #the showdown. James and I filed a petition demanding an emergency HOA meeting, backed by signatures from over 70% of the residents. The HOA couldn't refuse. On Friday evening, the meeting hall was packed. I stepped onto the stage, placing a thick stack of documents on the table. Linda Harper sat across from me, still wearing her smug expression. "Why have you called this meeting?" Linda asked mockingly. I stood up, taking the microphone. "I want to discuss how the HOA violated my property rights and destroyed my trees." Linda folded her arms. "Are we still on that, Judge Carter? We did what was necessary to maintain community standards." I smirked. "All right, let's show everyone what you consider necessary." I pressed a button on the remote. The screen behind me lit up, playing the security footage of the HOA cutting down my trees. The room erupted in shock. Linda's face paled, but she tried to stay composed. "You can't prove that was illegal." I held up a stack of papers. "This is my homeownership contract. The HOA had no legal authority to do this." Linda began to fidget. But I wasn't done. I placed another stack of documents on the table. "Now, let's talk about the HOA's finances." The room fell silent. I investigated and found that hundreds of thousands of dollars were suspiciously spent, I continued, looking Linda straight in the eye. "Can you explain why the HOA transferred $50,000 to a non-existent project?" Linda shot up from her seat. "You have no right to accuse me." I smiled. "I'm not accusing you. I'm just presenting the facts, and I think the residents here deserve to know the truth." The crowd exploded. "She's been stealing from us. We need a new board. Vote her out." Linda backed away, her face drained of color. She realized her game was over. #####, justice served. The next morning, police officers and financial investigators arrived at the HOA office. The HOA's accounts were frozen. Linda Harper was under investigation for embezzlement, ***. In the end, the HOA was dissolved. The residents elected a new board, fair, transparent, and accountable. As for me, I stood in my empty yard, where my oak trees once stood. They were gone, but I wasn't angry. Because I had planted something even greater. Justice. After Linda Harper was overthrown, the neighborhood plunged into chaos. Some people rejoiced at finally being free from the HOA's rule, but others were anxious. They wondered, without the HOA, who will manage the neighborhood? Who will ensure everything doesn't fall into disorder? ***. I understood their concerns. A system, no matter how flawed, leaves a void when it collapses. And that void needs to be filled. But before thinking about rebuilding, I had to make sure of one thing. Linda Harper could never come back. Linda Harper may have lost her position, but she was still not prosecuted. Over the past few days, I received word from investigators that the evidence of her corruption was strong, but not yet enough for a conviction. I wasn't satisfied with that. If Linda escaped justice, she could return, or worse, seek revenge. So, I decided to push the case further. I called an old friend, federal prosecutor Daniel Brooks. Daniel and I had worked together years ago. I knew he was a man of integrity who wouldn't overlook blatant corruption like this. "Daniel, I have a case for you," I said when he picked up. "I'm guessing it's about the HOA?" Daniel chuckled. "I've heard about your spectacular takedown. But tell me, what do you need from me?" "I need to make sure Linda Harper doesn't just lose her position. She needs to be prosecuted," I said bluntly. Daniel was silent for a moment. "Send me all the evidence you have. If I find enough grounds to elevate this to a federal case, I'll do it." I nodded. "Thanks, Daniel. I won't let this case slip away." While waiting for Daniel's response, I continued monitoring the situation in the neighborhood. Most residents were happy the HOA was gone, but a few were not pleased. And among them, one was particularly dangerous. His name was Richard Frazier, a loyal HOA member and Linda Harper's former right-hand man. I had never liked him. He was the type to bow before the powerful and bully the weak. When Linda was in charge, he was always by her side, monitoring residents, sending warning letters, and even intimidating those who dared to resist. Now that Linda was gone, Richard was still here. And he had no intention of giving up power. A week after the HOA was dissolved, I received an anonymous letter slipped under my door. "The HOA may have fallen, but you won't control this neighborhood for long. Not everyone believes in your so-called justice." I read the letter, then laughed. Richard was too obvious. He was the only one still clinging to the HOA, the only one with a motive to threaten me. But he had forgotten one thing. I am not easily intimidated. I decided to confront him directly. That evening, I went to Richard's house. I didn't knock. I simply stood in his front yard, waiting for him to come out. He didn't make me wait long. "David Carter," Richard said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I suppose you're here to get rid of me too?" I crossed my arms, meeting his gaze. "I'm here to talk." Richard scoffed. I have nothing to say to you. You destroyed the HOA. Do you think you're some kind of hero? I don't need to be a hero, Richard, I replied. I just need to make sure corrupt people never get the chance to control this neighborhood again. He narrowed his eyes. You think you've won, don't you? I tilted my head. Haven't I already? Richard clenched his fists. I could see the anger flaring in his eyes, but he held himself back. You think the residents here will let you decide everything? He asked. I'm not deciding anything, I said. They stood up and overthrew the HO. They voted to remove Linda Harper. I just brought the truth to light. Richard fell silent. He knew I was right. I don't care what you think of me, Richard, I continued. But I'll give you one piece of advice. Don't try to resurrect the HOA. Don't stir up trouble. If you do, I promise you'll be the next one under investigation. Richard sneered. Are you threatening me? I shook my head. No, just telling the truth. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, seething with rage. A few days later, I received a call from Daniel Brooks. David, I have good news for you, Daniel said. We've found enough evidence to elevate the case to a federal level. Linda Harper will be prosecuted for corruption and embezzlement. A satisfied smile crossed my lips. Thank you, Daniel, I said. At last, justice will be served. 1 month later, my neighborhood had completely changed. No more HOA, no more ridiculous rules. The residents formed their own management council, where everyone had a voice. My yard was still empty, but I didn't mind anymore. The oak trees may have been cut down, but I knew I had planted something even stronger. Justice. Linda Harper was gone, but the ghost of the HOA still lingered in the neighborhood. I could feel it in the wary glances of some residents, in the hushed conversations whenever I walked by. And more than anything, I could feel it in Richard Frazier. That man did not accept defeat. I knew he was planning a counterattack. I just didn't know when or how. But I wouldn't have to wait long. One morning, as I was about to leave for court, I found a letter slipped under my door. No sender, no return address. I opened it and read, Judge, do you think you've won? Do you think you can control everything? Think again. Not everyone in this neighborhood is on your side. Don't get too comfortable, or you will pay the price. I folded the paper and sighed. How amusing. Did Richard really think he could intimidate me with such childish tactics? I had faced far more dangerous criminals in my career. Murderers, drug traffickers, financial crime kingpins. An angry HOA member wouldn't keep me up at night. But I wouldn't underestimate him either. A desperate man can be dangerous. In the following days, I started hearing rumors that Richard was gathering a group of discontented residents. These people weren't necessarily Linda Harper's allies, but they felt directionless after the HOA was dissolved. Some worried that the neighborhood would fall into chaos without leadership. Richard saw an opportunity and seized it. He held secret meetings at his home, convincing people that I was taking control for myself. He claimed that if I weren't stopped, the neighborhood would become lawless and property values would plummet. I knew Richard didn't truly care about the community. He only wanted to regain power. But I couldn't let him succeed. As Richard worked to rebuild his influence, I received a crucial piece of news from Daniel Brooks. David, I've got something, Daniel said over the phone. I just found new evidence proving that Linda Harper not only embezzled HOA funds but also transferred some of that money into Richard Frazier's personal account. I narrowed my eyes. Are you sure? Absolutely, Daniel confirmed. We verified the transactions through the bank. Richard wasn't just an accomplice, he personally profited from the corruption. I chuckled. So he's not just trying to resurrect the HOA, he's trying to cover up his own crimes. Exactly, Daniel said. I've already sent the files to the DA's office. We're preparing an arrest warrant. I nodded. But I'll help you make this happen. I decided to use Richard's own plan against him. I knew he was planning a meeting with the discontented residents, aiming to vote on forming a new governing body. If he succeeded, he could legitimize his power before I had a chance to act. So I resolved to expose him right there. I reached out to a few neutral residents, asking them to attend the meeting and record everything secretly. I also alerted Daniel, arranging for a federal task force to be on standby, ready to move in at my signal. Everything was set. Now, we just had to let Richard walk into the trap. That evening, I arrived at the meeting with a calm demeanor. I sat in the back, listening as Richard delivered a passionate speech, proclaiming that the HOA needed to be restored and that the neighborhood required strong leadership. I know many of you feel uneasy without the HOA, he said, but I have a plan. I've worked with a team of legal experts to design a new system, one that will be fairer, more transparent, and more efficient. Some residents nodded, seemingly convinced. I knew that if I let him continue, he could actually win them over. So I decided to interrupt him. I stood up. That was quite an inspiring speech, Richard, I said. But before anyone rushes to vote, I have a question. How can we trust someone who embezzled HOA funds? The room fell silent. Richard scowled. What are you talking about? I held up a folder. This is bank transaction evidence, proving that you received over $50,000 from HOA funds before it was dissolved. A wave of murmurs spread through the room. Richard paled. This is slander, he shouted. I've done nothing wrong. I turned on a projector and played a video. It showed federal agents reading Linda Harper her charges, along with her testimony implicating Richard in the corruption scheme. When the video ended, a siren wailed outside. The meeting room door burst open. Federal officers stepped inside. Richard Frazier, one of them, announced, "You are under arrest for embezzlement and financial fraud." Richard stood frozen. The residents around him stepped away, as if he were contagious. I gave him one last glance before turning and walking out. The next morning, news of the arrest spread across the neighborhood. People whispered, but this time, it wasn't in fear, it was in relief. No more Linda Harper. No more Richard Frazier. No more HOA. The neighborhood was finally free. A week later, I stood in my yard, gazing at the empty space where the towering oak trees once stood. They had been cut down, but I no longer felt bitterness. Because I knew that in their place, I had planted something stronger, more lasting. Something no one could ever cut down. This story carries multiple layers of deep meaning, primarily revolving around justice, the fight against corruption, and the value of freedom. #1. Justice always prevails ****. The protagonist, a judge, persistently fights against those who manipulate and exploit power for personal gain. Even though Richard Frazier tries every possible way to regain control, he is ultimately exposed and held accountable. This reinforces the idea that deception may last for a while, but justice will always catch up in the end. #2. The danger of abused power ****. The HOA, Homeowners Association, was originally meant to help manage the community, but under the control of people like Linda Harper and Richard Frazier, it became a tool for oppression and manipulation. When the HOA was dismantled, some residents felt uneasy, not because it was truly necessary, but because they had been conditioned to believe that without it, chaos would ensue. This serves as a metaphor for how certain organizations or individuals use fear to maintain their grip on power. 3. Persistence and intelligence in the fight against evil ****. The protagonist is not only courageous but also highly strategic. He does not recklessly confront Richard but instead uses tactics and evidence to take him down in the very place Richard feels most secure, his meeting with the residents. This highlights the importance of careful planning and intelligent strategy when dealing with deceitful adversaries. #4. True freedom comes from breaking unjust chains ****. In the end, with Richard arrested and the HOA abolished, the community finally achieves true freedom. But this freedom is not just about removing an organization or an individual, it is about liberation from fear, oppression, and manipulation. The imagery of the fallen oak trees being replaced by something stronger and more enduring serves as a powerful metaphor, showing that what may seem like a loss can pave the way for positive, long-term change. #Conclusion. This story is not merely about a confrontation between the protagonist and the antagonists. It is a reflection on how power can be abused, how people can be manipulated by fear, and most importantly, how justice, truth, and perseverance can ultimately triumph. It sends a powerful message that no matter how cunning evil may be, it will always be exposed in the end, and true freedom is always worth fighting for.